Why does homosexuality exist despite seemingly not being evolutionary adaptive? In a high compression, one varied model that therefore is obviously mostly wrong. One could model the two sexes not as binary, but as spectrum. There is a metric which scientifically is a little bit controversial, which is called 4D to 2D ratio. It seems that prenatal androgen exposure lengthens the fourth digit, and estrogen exposure, I heard this a few times, lengthens the second digit. Digit ratios roughly range from 0.9 to 1.0. I just looked it up again. ChatGPT here mentions below 0.9 extremely low and above 1.05 high. I now invert my graph. And what results out of this now is based on prenatal androgen exposure, which seems to set the ceiling for lifelong androgen, a bimodal graph. I now added the subratios. So now, what is male typical? What is female typical? 0.95 to 0.97 is male typical, and female is 1.01 to 1.03. So for females, it's quite rare to have a 0.8, but it's quite common to have something in between 0.98 to 1.01. For males, the peak is at 0.96 to 0.98. For women, here again, the approximate central values for female. Continuing this one variable model, we could expand it to sexual attraction. A central value male usually would be probably attracted to a central value female. But what now if we have a male with a very high androgen exposure does a very low 4D to 2D ratio? First of all, the spectrum is not equally distributed. The frequency of the spectrum is not equally proportioned along the spectrum. This also probably resolves one of the central questions. So males on this end of the spectrum one could call hypermale. They are at least modulated by testosterone. So males on this end on the spectrum, at least just based on testosterone, one could call hypermale. Here then we would have hypomale. Here we would have hypofemale, meaning females here, at least based on prenatal androgen exposure approximated by the 4D to 2 ratio, would have significantly higher testosterone compared to central value female. Which brings up a very significant question. What does testosterone do? Male sexual differentiation, Wolffian duct development, internal male reproductive, fetal masculinization. DHT is especially important for external genitalia and growth of testes, penis, voice deepening, facial body hair, libidoing, spermatogenesis support, muscle and bone accrual. Muscle increases muscle protein synthesis, satellite cell activity, androgen receptor signaling, lean mass, strength potential. Effect size depends on dose, training, calories, not deep, but sleep, genetics. Bone increases bone mineral density directly and via aromatization to estradiol. Estradiol is critical for epiphyseal closure and male bone maintenance. Fat distribution favors lower fat mass, more visceral subcutaneous partitioning toward male patterning. Low testosterone often correlates with higher fat mass, but causality is bidirectional. Erythropoiesis raises red blood cell production via erythropoietin and iron metabolism. High levels can increase hematocrit. Libido and sexual function increases sexual motivation and erectile physiology permissiveness. Erectile function also depends heavily on vascular, neural, psychological, prolactin, and nitric oxide systems. Brain and behavior modulates motivation, reward sensitivity, dominance, status behavior, risk tolerance, aggression thresholds, spatial cognition, and sexual salience. Effects are context dependent, not simple, more aggression. Skin and hair increases sebum production, acne risk, body facial hair. DHT drives androgenic hair loss in genetically susceptible scalp follicle. Voice enlarges larynx and vocal folds during puberty, causing deeper voice, mostly irreversible after puberty. Reproduction. Intratesticular testosterone is required for spermatogenesis. Exogenous testosterone suppresses LH, FSH, and can reduce sperm production despite high serum testosterone. Acute versus chronic changes, minutes to hours, changes in arousal, motivation, threat, reward sensitivity, sexual salience, mostly neuromodulatory, modular, in context dependent. Days, weeks, libido changes, energy, perceived drive, water glycogen shifts, training aggression, erythropoiesis beginning, and weeks to months, muscle gain, strength increase, fat redistribution, acne, body hair changes, hematocrit rise, months to years, bone density, fertility effect, prostate effects, scalp hair miniaturization in susceptible men. How powerful testosterone is can be actually quite easily visualized with females, adult females, that didn't go through puberty with high androgen exposure. I mean, possibly a little bit higher, because they then tend to seek out activities like these. And this behavior might already have been modulated by slightly higher compared to central value female testosterone, or not testosterone in this case, but again, prenatal testosterone. So luckily, there are females who, in their adult life, expose themselves to high amounts of testosterone. Look at the face. It's not as clear as one would like it to be, but often the face masculinizes up to hyper male extents. So now, what kind of effects on sexual attraction does it if one deviates from the center as a male or female? And despite me already having read the answer probably a few dozen times, I will ask the question again. And so the question I asked is, do hypermasculine males prefer hyperfeminine females? Or it also could be the reverse. Hypermasculine males, let's just assume a subset, bodybuilders and athletes requiring traits that testosterone modulates upward. At least again, if we assume a one varied model of masculinity and femininity, which again is obviously wrong. So ChatGPT now differentiates between 4 different categories of hypermasculine. The category I'm interested in is high circulating testosterone, and prediction for preference for hyperfeminine females, modestly stronger preference for facial femininity. In other words, they both regress. And for both, we now still have to check the feminine side. So the question one could ask is, do hyperfeminine females also show a modestly stronger preference for hypermasculine males? ChatGPT now also integrated estrogen into the model. And here it states the following prediction. Complementary. Very feminine women prefer very masculine men. Plausible, weak direct support. Hormonal cycle. Some studies reported that women with higher estradiol show stronger preferences for male faces associated with higher testosterone. So now the one variable model becomes at least a 2 variable model. Testosterone and estradiol. Or rather, androgens and estradiol. Bottom, hyperfeminine females may show a slightly stronger average preference for hypermasculine males. Shorter male estradiol fertility cues are perceived safety. Male hypermasculinity is paired with status, research, own mate value is high. So it at least, by these priors, would be somewhat rational to assume that there is kind of a regression to the mean. Hypermasculine, hyperfeminine female, kind of both together as a bonding land again in the middle of the two sexes. But what now if a male has less and less prenatal, also adult circulating testosterone, up to the point where they are in the female range? I now want to introduce another 2 varied model that slightly overlaps with this model, because testosterone seems to modulate behavior and status, or at least interact with status and behavior in some fashion. We assume the more testosterone, the more dominant, the less testosterone, the less dominant, which there is also a word for. The opposite is called submission. Now, because the edge is usually not really existent, and because the edge is infinitely small, 0 doesn't exist really. It's just a line that separates 2 sets. So how now, within this model, could homosexuality evolve? There is some variance in prenatal testosterone, in estradiol, and also in the 40-2D ratio. Then there are scenarios within the same, someone is on the high test and someone is on the low test. So at least the effects caused by testosterone behavior modulating effect now kick in for the same. So a hyper masculine could falsely identify based on behavior, based on testosterone modulated variety, a male, because the male is in the female 40-2, because the male is in the female 40-2D ratio range. And the same could happen for the female, where a hypofeminine female is basically more masculine based on testosterone compared to central value masculinity. So they, instead of trying to pair with a male so high in test that it doesn't exist, now instead switch to domination and prefer a very feminine female. And both relations, also vice versa. So if so, are there domination submission roles in homosexual relationships? Yeah, but also ChatGPT.